Nightcast. Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth brings you the current news from the world today and how it relates to Bible prophecy. Understanding the end-time events leading to the peaceful world tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth.
Greetings, friends, and welcome to this April 30, 2014 edition of Nightcast. We've got a lot of news for you tonight. I've got the German story, the couple, and a new one too. Related to Germany, we've got a story out of Italy with Mussolini tonight. That's part of today's news. First, though, let's open up with what's going on over in the Ukraine, in the area of Europe. The U.S. has urged Russia to leave Ukraine in peace and warn that every inch of NATO territory will be defended if threatened. For that story, let's go now to Mariko Oy.
This is where it all started, Ukraine's capital, Kiev. To honor those who died during protests in February, ultra-nationalists marched on the Maidan Square. But it soon turned violent. Evidence of growing tensions across the country. In the eastern city of Luhansk, yet another seizure of official buildings by pro-Russian activists. The US and Ukraine have repeatedly accused Russia for funding this kind of operation. Russia flatly denies the accusation, and at the United Nations, a war of words has again erupted.
In fact, Russia continues to fund, to coordinate, and to fuel the heavily armed separatist movement. In addition, just outside of Ukraine's border, Russia has continued to engage in threatening troop movements that are designed not to calm tensions, but to embolden the separatists and to intimidate the government.
Our armed forces are in Russian territory. Now let's see. American forces are hardly at home. They're either in Australia, Lithuania, Poland, the Black Sea, where an American vessel has stayed longer than it was invited to. We don't have any aggressive pretensions against Ukraine.
Ukraine isn't part of NATO, but this crisis has put the entire alliance in tatters. In a harsh warning from US Secretary of State John Kerry, who said they'll defend every inch of its territory.
Most important, together, we have to make it absolutely clear to the Kremlin that NATO territory is inviolable. We will defend every single piece of it. Article 5 of the NATO treaty must mean something, and our allies on the front lines need and deserve no less.
But these warnings appear to be having little impact on the ground. These activists demand a referendum to break away from Kiev. And there are now concerns that the ongoing unrest may affect voting in next month's presidential election. Mariko Oy, BBC News.
Okay, thank you, Mary. And friends, in the United States, we've had a lot of upset weather. I reported last night to you. We showed a video of how the severe storms and heavy tornado winds blew a freight train right off of its tracks. We showed that video to you last night. You can go back to the archive and review that if you didn't see that. Blew a freight train right after the tracks. Almost unbelievable, but I've seen buildings, barns, huge barns actually be lifted into the air and crashed all over the neighborhood. And where there was a building, 10 seconds later, there's no building, just flat ground, and not even any trace of the building because it lifted it, took it, blew it away. But it blew a freight train right off the tracks. Again, we showed that video last night. That's in last night's news report. Tonight, there's a freight train unrelated to I believe this is unrelated to the severe storms, This freight train carrying crude oil derailed and burst into flames in Lynchburg, Virginia. Hundreds of people have been evacuated from a number of buildings in the city, but no injuries, thankfully, have been reported. Oil has been spilling into the James River, according to reports. 3 or 4 tanker cars carrying crude oil were breached, according to a tweet by the city of Lynchburg, and more than a dozen tanker cars were involved in this, what was a collision. A city spokesman said several train cars derailed at about 2 o'clock local time, 2 o'clock in the afternoon in Virginia. That would be 1800 Greenwich Mean Time, and about 300 people have been evacuated from nearby buildings. It happened very close to the city center. Lawyer John Francisco, who works in the city, told local television station WSET, Channel 13, he heard a loud noise that sounded like a tornado, and then saw flames rise high into the sky. Okay, we got it. Friends, for some reason my buttons aren't working over on our switch panel. In our next, I want to go ahead and get to it because I promised to play you this film last night when we ran out of time. Friends, this is a film that was produced in 1933, some 81 years ago, after Nazi propaganda films were made and given to Hitler as a gift. They're again now being screened in Berlin. The audience who watches these films in Berlin must attend a lecture and a debate before the screening, a move that some say is patronizing. Steve Evans has the report.
It is 80 years old, a classic of its time, and very Nazi. Hitler Youthquecks, a film about the spirit of sacrifice of German youth. Since the war, it's been banned to the general public. It's good drama, but propaganda. The Nazi son and the unshaven, brutish communist father.
Du hast ja das gelernt, was?
Du lass doch den Jungen, ja, der wird...
Was heißt das so, wenn hier was gesungen wird? Dann singst du... Völker hört die Signale auf zum Leben.
This film was made in 1933 and given as a gift by the film company to Hitler. 80 years on, it still remains controversial. It's well made. It is powerful. It is dangerous. So dangerous, the screenings have to be preceded by a lecture. Germans can only see the films if they're first told of the evils of the Nazis.
Maybe 20 years ago or so, people would have been more frightened to see these films in public. And now we can find that they are well-made films, that they have a propagandistic sort of message, but still it is part of our film heritage. At least we shall discuss them, we shall not lock away them.
But should this heritage be freely available, on DVD perhaps? Did the audience feel they needed the lecture?
I feel educated enough to qualify them for myself without explanation, without being patronized.
This movie, I can see that people would fall for it.
Germany's always coping with its past, even 70 years on. It does debate, it does think. As Germany reinvents itself as a global economic power, the shadow never goes. Stephen Evans, BBC News, Berlin.
Thank you, Stephen. And friends, we have another video from today's news that relates very much to this. You'll see in parts of this video, you'll see clips of Hitler and Mussolini side by side. At one time they were very buddy-buddy, both dictators though, and eventually it would have come down to when Hitler wanted to rule the world by himself. He wouldn't want another dictator around to compete with him. Now, in April 1945, thousands of Italians crowded into a Milan square to see the body of Italy's wartime fascist dictator Benito Mussolini. He and his mistress and his close associates, after they had been shot by partisans, their corpses were strung up by their feet for all to see. Poet Franco Loe, who was in the crowd that day, recalls witnessing the dramatic scene. Witness is a World Series radio program of the stories of our times told by the people who were there. This video, I'm going to tell you who produced it. I have to tell you that before we play it. After we come out of it, friends, I'm going to go rehearse the history of Mussolini, who claimed to have revived the Holy Roman Empire in 1936. I mentioned a little bit of that last night, and tonight after this video we're going to explain the significance of Mussolini's claim and how God used that to tip off or reveal to his end-time candlestick apostle for these days how Revelation, verse 10 of Revelation 13 was written for that time, that it was active in that time. It was pre-written, pre-spoken by Jesus Christ through the prophet John, the apostle John, who wrote from the Isle of Patmos. The setting, the stage, the time for that prophecy was 1936. I mean, that's written for our day. I'll explain that in more detail after we watch this 5-minute, very revealing video that was produced by Louise Hidalgo. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Hidalgo, and directed by Claire Tellior.
Aver sentito in casa cos'era il fascismo e cosa rappresentava, mia madre specialmente era una accanita antifascista.
One dictator by himself is always impressive, often terrifying. When two get together, the result should be twice as effective.
Abbiamo incominciato la storia vera, a soffrire davvero sulla nostra pelle quando sono venuti i bombardamenti.
The heavy aircraft of Bomber Command have, in a series of deadly blows, made Milan the Hamburg of Italy. In the recent all-Lancaster raid, turned Milan into a dead city.
E abbiamo visto le macerie, abbiamo visto la gente insanguinata.
Fascism, the Italian Empire, and after over 3 years of catastrophic warfare, the unconditional surrender of the Italian nation.
Si faceva una festa, insomma, è stata una festa. Però questa festa era contornata anche da le reazioni di alcune persone. Nel 1944 mi sono alzato un mattino, vedo mia madre che nasconde un giornale. Erano stati 15 banditi, anzi, erano stati fucilati in piazzale Loreto per rappresaglia dai tedeschi, perché avevano fatto un attentato. A scuola, tra l'altro, c'era un mio amico, andiamo a vederle. E quando siamo usciti da scuola, verso mezzogiorno, siamo andati a Piazzale Loreto a vedere. Tanto è vero che quando li ho visti io, la cosa che mi ha spaventato di più è stato vedere questo, che era sul mucchio con le mani così, davanti alla faccia, così. E lui era tutto insanguinato e la faccia, proprio che l'avevano picchiato, era tutta rigata di sangue. Ecco, questo mi ha spaventato. Sono stato 3 mesi senza voler più andare a letto da solo, perché avevo gli incubi.
The world will not forget the life and death of Benito Mussolini, the strutting, pompous braggart. He will be remembered as the man who boasted he would make a new Italy and died in an Italian gutter.
Mussolini è stato catturato e fucilato a Dongo insieme a tutti i gerarchi.
The macabre scenes in Milan, where the bodies of Benito Mussolini, his fascist accomplices and his mistress Clara Petacci were kicked and spat upon by a seething crowd.
Mio padre dice: io non l'ho mai visto da vivo e voglio vederlo da morto. E allora siamo andati a piazzare Loreto. Li avevano già appesi, mentre prima erano per terra. Però la gente, c'era gente che gli dava calci, che sputava sui morti. E Mussolini aveva gli stivali, era appeso per i piedi, appunto per gli stivali, e poi aveva la camicia slacciata. La folla, c'era pieno di gente dappertutto. È stato un silenzio come se fosse un cimitero. Io ero rimasto come sgomento a vedere questa cosa, questi corpi, né più nemmeno come ero rimasto sgomento quando ho visto i fucilati a piazzare Loreto.
Okay, that was from today's news, friends. And Mussolini, in 1936, let me put some slides up on the screen here for us. Let's move over to this slide for a moment. When the fifth seal, which you'll see counting 5 columns over on this is to depict the seals of Revelation, the first 6 of the seals. The fifth seal, the Great Tribulation, when that kicks off, that's going to represent a time that you're going to see in a chart that I'm going to put up on the screen, and I'll explain that in a moment. Just remember that 5th column over where it mentions Great Tribulation, and we'll come back to this chart. But I want to switch over to a chart from a booklet that the Pastor General, the Apostle, the Candlestick for the Philadelphia era of our church produced in a book that he used in a couple of books that he wrote. And a book on Revelation being unveiled at last. And in this top part of this chart, if we zoom in on it, I zoomed in on it here last night, right here, you'll see this pictures 7 beasts. Now, I know you only see 4 elements here, but the first beast pictured by the gold head of a statue and by a lion from Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 represents King Nebuchadnezzar, as Daniel explained it to the king. The second beast, pictured in Daniel 2 as arms and chest of silver, and in Daniel 7 as a bear, represented another kingdom. The belly and thighs of brass from Daniel 2, and the leopard that had 4 heads from Daniel 7 actually represented 4 kingdoms. And then the 7th, what would be the 7th beast, because it's a 4th beast and yet it's 7 kingdoms, because the 3rd beast has 4 heads representing 4 kingdoms or 4 heads. So now you got your 7th head that has 10 horns on it. All that's pictured, and that's in Daniel 7. In Daniel 2, it's simply pictured as 2 legs of iron. And at the bottom of those legs, when we go to the bottom part of the chart, it's going to talk about those 2 legs of iron having 10 toes. And those 10 toes they'll relate to another beast that has 10 horns. But if we come out of this chart here, over on the other side of the chart it explains these things. Now, I'll tell you where to find this chart in another program. In fact, this weekend we're going to cover this in even greater detail. But let's go down to the bottom part of the chart. The bottom part of the chart here. And let's come on down. There's a point where, let me come back up to the top for a minute. There's a point where you'll see at the bottom, in the bottom row, there's a woman that you see in red, and she's riding a dragon, and it's got 10 horns on it. 3 of those horns she causes to be uprooted, she being the leader of a great religion. Then that leaves 7 horns. So as we come down to the bottom of this chart, the remaining 7 horns are discussed. 5 of them, before the red line that you see here, have come and they've gone. They've come, they've existed, and they're no more. The 6th and 7th of the remaining horns we'll find, let's go down to the bottom part of this chart, we'll find below the red line. Now the red line is a dividing point for the 5 that are fallen, that the last of which existed up until 1814 when Napoleon was overthrown, and representing the Roman government that lasted for 1,260 years. But I don't want to get too heavy in the details. There is a point I want to make. Now if we go down to the left-hand side of these bottom 2 columns, we see we've got the 6th, we've got the 9th horn and the 10th horn, as Daniel called them in Daniel 7. You'll see the picture of the statue. If you can make that out, there's, with the 9th horn, there's the 2 legs of iron. With the 10th horn, there are the 2 legs extending down into the feet, and 10 toes on the total toes on the feet. But what I really want to focus on, let's bring this over to the other side, and I want to focus on this bottom right side of the chart, where the 6th head ridden by a woman, mentioned in, I said Revelation 13 earlier, I should have said Revelation 17. Verse 10 of Revelation 17 talks about 5 that are fallen, 1 that is, and 1 that's yet to come. Now, at the time when Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong saw this verse, Mussolini, or at the time God revealed what this verse meant to him, Mussolini had just claimed in newspaper articles published briefly that Mussolini claimed when he invaded Ethiopia that he had revived the Holy Roman Empire. This alerted Mr. Armstrong to something God wanted Mr. Armstrong to see and understand. I'm talking about Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong. And God used this to help Mr. Armstrong see that this prophecy was written for his time, 1936. Now that head that is, you could say in one way it existed from 1870 to 1945, but at the time in 1936 when Mussolini made the big claim to have revived the Holy Roman Empire, that alerted Mr. Armstrong to study it, look into it. God opened his mind to see that this prophecy, this 6th head, had been revived during Mr. Armstrong's lifetime. Friends, no one before Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong and no one after him, well, it wouldn't matter after him, anybody that can see what God opened up and revealed and shared to us through and from Mr. Herbert Armstrong, you can't claim, you don't have a first right to that information when it's been given through someone else. No one before Mr. Armstrong was giving that information. And God did that. I read Revelation 1, verse 1 last night briefly. Friends, we're going to have to go over time just a little bit tonight. I will hurry through this. But this is important for those of you who want to stay and really grab into something. And I have some news we're going to close with about a disease. I've got that chart on the screen. I'm going to finish what I'm saying about Mussolini and Mr. Armstrong and the sixth head and the seventh head being equivalent to the ninth head and the ninth horn and the 10th horn of Daniel in just a moment, and how there's one head, the seventh head, the 10th horn, yet to come. I'll finish that in a moment, but let's mention this related to the fourth seal, the fourth column over, where you see the number 4 depicted in Revelation as a pale horse with a rider whose name is Death, alongside whom Hades, hell, the grave rides. One of the characteristics, one of the primary characteristics that Jesus Christ described in plain language about this horse. Of course, the plain language that Christ used at the time was Greek, and the word he used, as recorded by the Gospel writers Matthew, Mark, and Luke, was loimos. Loimos means disease, epidemics, pestilence, the plagues. And in prophecies related to this pestilence, it tells us that 1/3 of the people of the earth will die from pestilence and disease epidemics. 1/3 of them will die from the third horse, the black horse of famine. And 1/3 will be taken captive. Many of them will die in captivity. Eventually, about 10% will be left alive, a remnant, to live on over into a wonderful, happy, peaceful world tomorrow, ruled over and led by Jesus Christ as the King of Kings, ruling in a one world government, where we won't have all the strife from the red horse of war and rumors of war that we have today. It won't exist anymore. And the story I have after I tell you about this relates to that pale horse and the disease epidemics. There is a disease that the World Health Organization has announced today is so bad and so rampant. It resists antibiotics, and it causes people to die if you get the least little infection, and they're very concerned about it becoming a worldwide epidemic, something that is spreading and spreading and spreading. Now, I'll give you the story. I wanted to just give you a teaser on it so you'll know, okay, it's worth sticking around a little longer tonight for that story. But let's finish up what I was saying about Mussolini claiming to have revived the Holy Roman Empire in 1936. And now, by saying he claimed it, I'm not trying to poke fun at that. By the claim he made, it alerted Mr. Armstrong to look into it, study, pray, fast about it, and God used that to show Mr. Armstrong, during your day, at this time, even before World War II has broken out, I, the great God, have caused the Holy Roman Empire to be revived, and to be revived as this sixth head mentioned in Revelation 17. 5 have fallen, 1 is. And this Mussolini and Gabriele before him, they were all part of this revival of the Holy Roman Empire for its sixth head. But then in 1945, everything, that was all smashed. In fact, that video we just saw where Mussolini was strung up, I think he was strung up, what was it, 1944? Anyway, that ended the Holy Roman Empire, put it back in abyss, that put it back in the pit. So the sixth head had a brief revival. It came out of the pit and existed for a little while, went back into the pit. So now we're at the point where 1 is yet to come. That 1 that's yet to come is the seventh head, which has 10 horns. And the 10 horns that, let's see if we can back this up, the 10 horns that Daniel mentioned, the 10th horn of those 10 horns has 10 toes. And that 10th horn with 10 toes of Daniel, you've got to spreadsheet this out, as Mr. Armstrong told us to do, and he did that for us in this chart. he put the 10th horn with the 10 toes, the 10th horn with the 10 toes of Daniel. He put that on the left side of this chart, and then over on the right side of the chart, he's got the equivalent, the seventh head with the 10 horns over on the right side. And now I combined this. I just took the middle part out so you can easily see the 10th horn lines up with the 7th head and 10 horns. And that 10th horn that's equal to the 7th head has 10 toes, and those 10 toes are equal to those other 10 horns. Now what that means, friends, is this. That relates to 10 nations, 10 European nations, which will, as Revelation explains, Daniel explains, will give their power for an hour, for a short time, to another emperor to be coronated, most likely in Frankfurt, Germany, most likely an Assyrian, meaning a German emperor. Very unlikely to be a Frankish emperor. There were, up till Napoleon, some Frankish emperors, and then mostly it's been Assyrian, German emperors of the Holy Roman Empire. They'll give their power to this emperor. And the Pope, who coronated most of the other emperors of the Holy Roman Empire, will hold the coronation ceremony and crown this new emperor that the Bible calls a beast, who's yet to come and who is the 7th head of Revelation 17, the 10th horn of Daniel 2 and 7, and the 10 toes, or the 10 horns of that 7th beast, being 10 nations in Europe, 5 from the east, 5 from the west. They will not get along. They're, as toes, they're compared to 5 of miry clay and 5 of iron. And as you may well know, iron and clay doesn't mix, meaning they won't get along. East and west doesn't usually get along too well. Constantinople, Rome, and yet, because of events in the world that are frustrating, like what led up to World War II, round 2 of World War, was there was a lot of frustration. People were just frustrated. They were broke. They were hungry. Economies were low. Jobs were low. Things were difficult, and it enabled Hitler to grab the reins and run with them. When we see a situation like that and certain events that just really accelerate arguments between nations and the kind of thing that Ukraine situation, crisis is fostering, could well lead to what the atmosphere and climate that existed back before World War II. And as we watch this, we watch the news, it's amazing to me how the United States does not recognize its fallen from grace position, that God is busting the pride of the United States power. In the early news tonight, we saw U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry making claims about, involving NATO and all this, and yet NATO's having problems. This could be the end of NATO, this Ukraine situation. We see a lot of reports on that. I need time to go through it. I can't take that time tonight, but we will. Just keep those comments and statements in mind. Now, I said I was going to come back to, and I wanted you to know, there was a prophet God used in 1936 and beyond until he died in 1986, some 50 years later, and continues to use, even though he's in the grave, recordings of his broadcast, his telecast, his sermons, his Bible studies are all over the internet. We play them on the weekends on a different channel called the Sabbath Channel here on cogtv.org, and he's still alive. It is as if Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong were still alive, with his recordings speaking for him as if it were from the grave. And he's a man that some believe God will resurrect to be the end-time Zerubbabel. We'll be explaining some of that on the weekends, too. I'm going through the end-time Elijah on the weekends at the current moment in time. But let me get back to our point here. The 1936 Mussolini situation, with Mussolini making headlines as having revived the Holy Roman Empire. Mr. Herbert Armstrong saw that, realized that, hey, friends, Revelation 17, verse 10, 5 are fallen, and 1 is, the time of that 1 is, was during Mr. Armstrong's time in 1936 and beyond until 1944, 1945. The Holy Roman Empire had been revived as in its sixth headship, and the sixth head was revived in those years of Mr. Armstrong's life. He was born in 1892, so in 1936, when he saw that newspaper report of Mussolini reviving the Holy Roman Empire, at that time Mr. Armstrong would have been 44 years old, and he would have been then roughly about 7 years into God having called and begun to call him and train him for the ministry work that he'd have him do for the rest of his life. And that caused a lot of us that are viewers of this program to be here. And I know I have other viewers too, and I know I may have just gone way above some of your heads. I see the reports telling me who's viewing the different areas we're on, and some of you I know have not had any experience with Mr. Armstrong, our church, and the prophecies that a lot of our brethren that watch this program understand. And brethren, many of you understand the prophecies about disease epidemics, the fourth seal. And let me cover that story from the World Health Organization, where this story that just broke today that shows Superspreader Tracking tuberculosis. Now, I've got two stories. This first one, I've got a video report for you, and then I'm going to give you the bigger story, no video, but I'll give you the details about that disease that is spreading rampantly, that antibiotics are not killing, and that are so lethal. You get this disease, then you get a minor infection, and you die from the minor infection because your immune system is all shot out from this other disease thing. But first, let's go to this story with video showing how South Africa is particularly hard hit by the disease of tuberculosis. It is only one of only 2 countries where incidence of tuberculosis is still rising. The problem you'll see in this video report is that many cases are now resistant to drug treatment, just like the other disease I'll tell you about in a moment. Meaning some patients are being sent back home while they're still infectious, meaning other people can pick it up from those people. Now, a team at the University of Cape Town in South Africa is using new tools to investigate how the return of patients to their communities affects the spread of the disease. Mira, I may have a hard time with your last name. Mira Sinthlingam has been seeing the trial in action.
Look beyond Cape Town's scenic views and you find miles of township settlements where tuberculosis is rife. This airborne infectious disease is the leading cause of death in South Africa. The dense housing in townships provide the perfect environment for the disease to spread. Zizipho recently moved here to the Dunoon township. She was diagnosed with TB 1 month ago.
I'm 19 years old. When I moved here at Eastern Cape, I got ill. And then I went to the clinic, and at the clinic they told me that I'm having TB.
Treatment for TB used to take 6 months. But now many people, like Zizipho, have strains of the disease that are harder to treat, known as drug-resistant TB.
I've come to Brooklyn Chest Hospital, one of the main hospitals in the region treating patients with drug-resistant TB. As doctors run out of treatment options, hospitals like this are running out of space, and patients are being sent back into their communities whilst they're still infectious.
That's why scientists here have developed new techniques to find out exactly how the disease spreads when patients like Zazippo return to their communities.
So we are using this device called a cough aerosol sampler to quantitate the infectiousness of TB patients, where we try to measure the number of TB bacteria in the cough droplets of patients with drug-resistant TB. And what we are finding is that most patients actually do not have any live TB bacteria in their cough. There's only a small minority of patients which have a very high number of TB bacteria in the cough.
These patients are known as superspreaders because an incredible 80% of infections are spread by just 20% of infected people. Hospitals have limited capacity, so if these superspreaders can be identified, precious resources can be targeted towards them. Through taking part in the study, Zazippo discovered she was not a superspreader, reducing the chances of her 2-year-old daughter catching the disease from her. But by finding and monitoring superspreaders, the researchers hope to find infection hotspots in the townships and eventually develop ways of controlling TB spread in those areas. Miro Santhilingam, BBC News, Cape Town.
And friends, this report from South Africa about tuberculosis, the problem of disease epidemics is not limited to just Africa here. In this next story I have for you, this is a report by Pippa Stevens, the health reporter for BBC News, that shows that antibiotic resistance now poses a global threat, not just as Africa. We're talking about a global major threat. Resistance to antibiotics poses, I'm reading her article to you now, poses a major global threat to public health, says a new report by World Health Organization, WHO. It analyzed data from 114 countries and said resistance was now happening in every region of the world. Let me restate that. Let me repeat that for you. Resistance is happening now in every region of the world. WHO described a post-antibiotic era where people die from simple infections that have been treatable for decades, but not anymore. There were likely to be devastating implications unless significant action was taken urgently, the report added. The report focused on 7 different bacteria responsible for common serious diseases such as pneumonia, diarrhea, and blood infections. The report suggested 2 key antibiotics no longer work in more than half of the people being treated in some countries. Quote, "What we urgently need is a solid global plan of action which provides for the rational use of antibiotics," Dr. Jennifer Cohen said. One of them, carbapenem, is a so-called last resort drug used to treat people with life-threatening infections such as pneumonia, bloodstream infections, and infections in newborns caused by the bacteria K. pneumonia. Bacteria naturally mutate. Bacteria naturally mutate to eventually become immune to antibiotics, but the misuse of these drugs, such as doctors overprescribing them, and patients failing to finish courses, means it's happening much faster than expected. That's not the only reason, friends. God has prophesied, and of course there may be some natural explanation reasons for some of this, but God has prophesied a worldwide disease epidemic that would wipe out, that would kill 1/3 of the world's population for the end time. And this news story, this should be ringing some bells for some of us who know that prophecy. This is the beginning news story of here it comes, friends. How fast will it come? Well, we'll just have to keep watching the news for a little bit, but it's on the way. And once it hits, once you can hear about somebody telling you, I'm setting up a trap. I got the cheese on it. I got the spring over here. I got the thing baited, and everything is set, ready to go. And it's happening right in front of your eyes. And by the time by the time some people wake up to the news story, the snap is going to be hit. The worldwide spread of the disease is going to be so rampant and so fast that, what can you do about it? Well, there is something you can do about it. God promises, if you've got your electronic Bible there, you'll be able to do a search that effectively makes your electronic Bible in either your computer or your little small smartphone. It makes your Bible program like an electronic concordance, and you can punch in the words, none of these diseases. Punch in those 4 words. None of these diseases. And see which scripture you get with that, and see what God says around that scripture. You should look at the scripture, and I will put it up on the screen. I'll plan to put that up on this weekend on our Sabbath channel live stream. That verse, God tells you that if you obey him, he promises you none of these diseases. You've got like an immunity, an exclusion from this worldwide, very infectious disease if you are faithfully obeying your Creator. Now that means you've got to know and know that you know and understand what God says it is you should be obeying and doing. And some of you who are watching, you've either heard preachers or you attend a congregation or service now where a preacher tells you, Christ paid the penalty of sin, and more than that, he just did away with the law. He nailed it to the cross with him, which is not what happened. Christ got nailed to the cross, and until Christ, the ritualistic law that was added because of transgression, that was a law until Christ. Well, yeah, and when Christ came, that didn't get nailed to the cross. When Christ came, that law was abolished. That had finished its course. That ritualistic law. But the other law that people were violating, that caused God to put into effect that ritualistic law, that law continues. That is a law of love. That's a law that says don't steal from your neighbor. That's a law that says don't commit adultery with his wife. Don't even lust after her or any other woman. Don't steal, don't bear false witness against your neighbor. And those are the parts that affect mankind. And the first part of those laws are how to love your fellow man. The first part of God's law in the 10 Commandments tell you how to love God. And one of those laws tells you a certain day that God designated that he says to remember. You do all that, God promises you, and you do it faithfully, and you do it with a cheerful heart, God says, none of these diseases. Now there's a little more to this story. The WHO, the World Health Organization, says more new antibiotics, I have a hard time saying that word. I don't use antibiotics. There's a way, friends, those of you even who are faithful, and you say, hey, well, my doctor, my dentist told me to use a whole pile of penicillin, which has all kinds of side effects, by the way. I was able to find a lady in a health store who told me, hey, the equivalent good part of what penicillin does can be accomplished even better with a certain dosage of, what was it she told me about, and I got it, and I tried it, and my dentist was impressed. It was echinacea and golden seal, a little combination of that. I did that for 3 days instead of the penicillin that the dentist had prescribed to me, and lectured me in front of a dozen or two students while I was strapped in his chair. When I asked him, was there some natural way other than penicillin I could do it, and he gives me this big lecture in front of his students about how awful to try this natural way would be and how wonderful his medicine way was. Well, I tried the other way. I tried the natural way, came back, and it was wonderful. When he asked me, did I take my medicine? He didn't say, did I take the penicillin? He said, medicine. Well, you can call natural methods medicine. You know, even God speaks of having medicine from leaves of trees. And I said, yes, sir, I did. And he looked in my mouth and he said, amazing. And he tells all the other students, he says, and this is the best I've ever seen. Why, there's not even a trace of infection, and usually there is. But this is the cleanest I've ever seen. He had my mouth wired open, so I couldn't speak at that moment. I would have loved to have said, while all those students were right there with him, yeah, Doc, and I tell you what I did. I didn't take that penicillin. I took echinacea and golden seal, mostly just echinacea. And to hear him be saying, why, the infection cleaned out better than any I've ever seen before. This is the best I've ever seen, clearing out of the infection. And for the 3 days he was telling me to take penicillin every 3 hours, I was taking the echinacea golden seal every 3 hours. But you need to check with your health advisor now. Don't take my thing on that, but God gave me a nice natural way to clear out the infection and avoid the antibiotics. So, you know, I'm just reading you this report, friends. The WHO says, WHO being WHO, the World Health Organization, says more new antibiotics need to be developed. They're already saying the antibiotics that used to work aren't working. These disease strains are getting worse, so now they got to come up with some stronger antibiotics that talk about side effects from the previous stuff. They're going to make them stronger. They have side effects. They might cure the one thing. They're going to knock you off they're going to put you in the grave with strong stuff that does something else to you. Maybe even more suffering in the long run. You live longer, but you suffer the whole time. I'd rather go ahead and be wiped out if I had to be wiped out by a disease. But you don't have to be. You research that scripture, none of these diseases. Keep God's law, and you'll see God can bless you with life and keep you going. The rest of the report says they want to develop stronger antibiotics, while governments and individuals should take steps to slow this process. I don't know what they mean by that. In its report, the WHO said resistance to antibiotics for E. coli urinary tract infections had increased from virtually zero in the 1980s to being ineffective in more than half of the cases today. In some countries, it said resistance to antibiotics used to treat the bacteria would not work in more than half of the people treated. And friends, there's more, but it's just restating some of the same things over and over again. And I'm now at the 1 hour point for our program tonight. And let me see. Let me look real quickly. I'm just about at the 1 hour point. I need to tell you what maybe else I had here for you to show you. I tell you what we'll do, whatever I had, I can't, my teleprompter, I'm trying to get it up. We'll show it to you Sunday night. And thanks for joining me tonight. Wait a minute. Today's Wednesday. We'll be back, God willing, we'll be back Thursday night, tomorrow night, Thursday night here on Nightcast. I'll show you the last video I was going to show you next. Thank you for joining me tonight, dear friends, and thank you for bearing with us for a longer report tonight. This disease epidemic story is one I believe you should hear and heed. Look up that scripture on none of these diseases. Start, if you're not already, start obeying God. One of my buddies in Germany, one of his favorite scriptures is Acts 3:19, which talks about repent. I got to go. Thanks for joining me. Until next time, your host Stephen Lloyd Gilbert saying, so long, friends.
You have been watching Nightcast with Stephen Lloyd Gilbert. Nightcast can be seen Sunday through Thursday nights here on cogtv.org. Tonight's program is also available anytime on demand in the cogtv.org video archive.